Classroom Life Church. For the next 16 minutes, my name is Pastor Black, and today I'm going to be your tour guide through the book of Nehemiah. Nehemiah, along with a few others, are my absolute favorites in the Bible. Nehemiah is a story of the power of the human spirit that God has placed within us. He took a situation that was absolutely trashy, horrible situation, and he turned it around for God's glory. If you haven't, Nehemiah is one of those books that you probably don't read that often. It's a smaller book in the back of it's in the middle of the Old Testament. And most of those books I kind of pass over because most of my class were in Pentateuch and New Testament. So just to be honest, I hadn't read it until recently. But it's an absolute amazing story that we're going to go through today. And we're going to see that that Nehemiah, he united a nation. He rebuilt walls and restored dignity to its people. But more than anything, what we're going to see from the life of Nehemiah is that he lived for what he loves. And that's what we're going to see in our own lives too. We're going to see that mirrored in ourselves. We live for what we love, and our actions will show that. When I was just becoming a dad, I had just joined the Army, and my first son was born. And he inhaled some things that burnt his lungs, and actually he had no tissue in his lungs that was still alive. And so he went to the NICU, and he was given just a few hours to live. And so we did everything we could for him because we lived for what we loved. We prayed for him. Actually, to be completely honest, we didn't pray for him. I was in such shock that we didn't. But I had the presence of mind to call my grandpa, and he started praying prayer chain going. God bless elderly and their prayer chains because they're absolutely amazing. I actually have some pictures of my son when he was born. I'm going to pass them around. We're having technical issues today. But yeah, once we got this prayer chain going, he went from being able to live just a couple hours to a full recovery within 24 hours. Wow. And he was even medevaced from Eugene, Oregon to UCSF in San Francisco, where it's one of 4 places in the United States at the time that did this procedure called ECMO, and they would drill into one vein, take out your blood, and oxygenate it, and put it in the other side before it hit your brain. And once he got to UCSF, he just completely recovered. And that's the power of our God. And I see that repeated in my own life. In Iraq, when I should have died because of mortars, they were duds. So our God is there for us in our lives. And sometimes in the chaos, we may not see him. We may not feel his presence, but he is always there. He was always there. Kind of got off on a tangent. That's free. That's not part of our sermon today. But in our son, we lived for what we loved. What about us? How does that play out in our own lives? What about our jobs? How much effort did it take to get that last promotion? Because I know that sometimes I'd worked my fingers to the bone trying to get that last promotion, trying to get that recognition that showed that how I was better for this job than anybody else. And I remember at times going home absolutely exhausted, having nothing left for my family. But really that shows us where our values are. Our actions show us our values, they show us what's important to us, and in the end, they show us how we live for what we love. What about our looks? How much time do we spend on our looks? How much time do we spend shopping? I kind of like shopping, I'm not going to lie. So I spend a little bit more time than most people. So, but what about that mani-pedi you've been wanting? If you got it, I'm sure it looks fabulous. But but what we spend our money on, what we spend our time on. And what about our kids? A lot of times we wish we could find every once in a while, I can't say a lot of times, every once in a while our kids will just get under our skin, and we wish we could just find a genie and rub that lamp and get rid of those kids. But we wouldn't, because we love them too much, and we know that no matter how much effort it requires and how much work it requires, it's worth it in the end. Yeah, those kids. So, in the life of Nehemiah, Nehemiah was a cupbearer, and he's in a higher position. the king usually trusts them, and they usually have closer relationships. Some other cupbearers in that time that aren't in the Bible also had other very important jobs. And so the cupbearer was a pretty important person. And while all the rest of the Jews had been returning to Jerusalem, Nehemiah had stayed behind, and he was the cupbearer for one of the kings. And so he had special access. And so when he was chilling in Persia doing his cupbearer thing, some Jews had ended up coming back to him. And they were like, yeah, haven't you heard? The walls are torn down. Everything is burned down. Our city lays in ruins. And can you imagine hearing something you love so much, something that you identified so much, being destroyed? It must have felt like getting punched right in the baby maker, because that would have absolutely crushed me. But the Bible tells us that he wept and mourned for months. He heard this, and then for 3 months he wept and he mourned. It's important for us to see in this story how Hebrews used to mourn. They would rip their clothes. They would throw dust on their hair, wear itchy burlap for clothes. I mean, these people didn't hold it back. Kind of reminds me of my youngest son. He has an artist's spirit, and he loves and feels and everything more than regular people. And when he's upset, you know it. Like when he cries, his face gets all red and splotchy, and his voice gets all shrill and scratchy. And I mean, when he's upset, you know it it comes from the core of his being. And that's the way a lot of Hebrews would mourn. They would rip their clothes, they would wail, they would moan, they would fast, they would pray. And that's what Nehemiah did. He mourned for 3 months. And so when he's hanging out with the king, doing his cupbearer duties, he selected the wine and brought it to the king. And the king takes one look at him and he's like, all right, Nehemiah, what's going on? And so he tells him. Now, Nehemiah had to step carefully, because the king in the previous book, in chapter 4, had just made a decree that, all right, I destroyed you, you're not going to rebuild anything. So this king had just made a decree. He's like, my word stands, you're done, you're not rebuilding anything. But, so Nehemiah was going to go back and ask that same king to overturn one of his own proclamations. And I've never talked to a king, but I'm sure that that's a tough position to be in, because he knew he loved Jerusalem so much. It was the home of his people. He actually had a house there that he would rebuild later. And it was so much in his heart that he couldn't not put himself in the line of danger to take care of his place. So the king allows him to go. I'm not sure who he used as a poison taster in the meantime, but he comes into our story later, so it must have been a good choice. Excuse me. So Nehemiah goes to the walls, and he takes his horse and rides around the city. He doesn't tell anybody that he's there, and he just sees destruction. And I can only imagine how much it would feel, because how bad it would feel, seeing the destruction of your home. And anyway, but Nehemiah's not the type of person that would just let something go like that. He's a man of action, and that's what I like about him and this story. The power of the human spirit that God placed within him is absolutely incredible, and his willingness turns back on fear when a lot of people would be drawn into complacency, paralyzed by the danger to him. He actually went out and he pushed and fought against what he didn't think was right. And you know what the scary thing is? I believe in our churches, a lot of our churches are pulled down with complacency. A book I was reading, I'm going to read you a quote from that. It says, complacency is a blight that saps energy, dulls attitudes, and causes drain on the brain. The first symptom is satisfaction with the way things are. The second is rejection of things as they might be. Good enough becomes today's watchword and tomorrow's standard. Like water, complacent people follow the easiest course. Downhill. They draw false strength from looking back. Now, in our own lives, we can just accept things for the way they are. But I believe that God has placed within us each a special vision. He created you specifically to achieve that. And the same with Nehemiah here. He created him with that spirit, with that willingness to turn his back on fear and to push on. So Nehemiah, he's walking around the outside of this destroyed city, and he finally starts talking to the people, and he gets everybody on board right away. And the thing is he unites an entire city. This is one of the biggest cities in the ancient world, not the biggest by far, but this is one of the biggest cities in the ancient world, and he united them right away. And people started work on this wall, and it was completed within 2 months, not without its troubles. But it was completed within 2 months. Everybody was working. The nobles were working. The priests were working. The women and the were working alongside their fathers. And this wasn't just something that. This wasn't just a. Sorry, I lost for words for a second. Everybody was out there, except for a few nobles that decided they weren't going to get their hands dirty by working alongside them. But the whole community came together. But you got to know that the people working there didn't always like each other. And if you would be honest with yourself, don't look around right now, but just think in your mind's eye. If you were to look around right now, I bet you could see at least 2 or 3 people in this church that you felt the same way about. But we push forward. We love our church. We love Jesus, and we want to build God's kingdom. So we work alongside these people, having the grace for them to let them be who they are. We have grace and space for them. But are we gonna stay? Do we allow ourselves to stay with the status quo? I read a book called Tribes by Seth Godin. And I'm going to read you a quote here that it's always stuck with me. It's change requires bravery. Following the rules does not. Where do we need to make our change? In the course of life, we've let those dreams that God has given us, that God has placed within our hearts, we've let those pass us by. Where do we need to make that change at? Change requires the bravery. And let me tell you, you live for what you love. And if you're not pursuing that right now, what do you need to get rid of? Because there's always things that we can jettison for our life. Take that God-given desire, take that God-given dream and pursue that. Because that is true happiness. Facing your fears can be hard. When the tsunami hit Japan, they had an early warning system, and so a lot of fishermen they were paralyzed by fear. They stayed put. But there was one guy in a small island up north, and he set out for deeper waters, knowing that he had to face that tsunami. That if he was going to ever survive this and ever help his family and ever make this and be a help to his people afterwards, he needed to head out into deeper waters. And so he headed straight towards it. And it was coming at him at 100 miles an hour. And he said he'd seen 5-meter waves before, which is 25 feet. But this one was easily 5 times that. And he headed straight at this tsunami. And it took him, and he went right up the face. And I can only imagine looking up the face, seeing the top, and looking back down 100 feet, knowing that this was probably it. But it took him, and it threw him, and 4 other came. And 4 other waves came. But he made it. He made it for his people. He lived for what he loved, and he turned out to be able to be one of the only boats that would ferry supplies to people that were hungry and starving from things that were absolutely devastated. So in our own lives, I urge you, don't let the regular things of life come up and cloud up the things that we actually should be doing. We have God-given dreams.